Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 18th of July, and we're analyzing the tactical situation in and around Pokrovsk and Murad. We're going to look at the orders of battle for the Russian and Ukrainian sides, respectively. And right as I was beginning to record this video, we received a new update from the situation right around Yablonivka and around Touretsk. So we're going to focus the end of today's upload on those developments. But as I reiterated at the beginning, I do want to really devote a lot of time to what's going on just in the northeast of Pokrovsk. I want to zoom in, first of all, on this advance that is occurring on the northern flank, as I refer to it. You can see over here the Russian forces were able to capture 3.55 square kilometers of territory. This capture includes much of the villages of Fedorivka, Boykivka, and Novocheretse. The advance through Novocheretse bisects the village, advancing along the main road, pushing up vertically. You can see over here that advance amounts to 1.8 kilometers northwards, meaning the Russians are getting awfully close to this specific paved road that then connects to a litany of other populated areas on a completely different line of defense that is actually tangential to what's going on in Pokrovsk and is actually much more forward looking at the defense nodes that are supposed to protect the Ropilia. So we'll zoom out in a moment to show you that. But you can see over here Mayak, Pankivka, and then most importantly, Volodymyrivka, all within the purview of this specific road. And now the Russians are awfully close to arriving at Volodymyrivka, only about 2.5 kilometers away. So you do have this line over here in anti-tank ditch. So that is a formidable line to overrun. But we've seen, as exhibited based on Russian activity over the past couple of weeks, they have been able to pretty quickly overrun Ukrainian defense lines, standalone lines that are obviously very wide and span a huge amount of territory, but aren't multifaceted. So just breaching the line at one point and then just taking advantage of that is very easy for the Russians in areas where the Ukrainians don't have enough infantry devoted, because you're looking at a lot of these sectors that are northeast of Murad, for instance, and you're asking yourself, how is it possible for the Russians to break through at rapid paces and consolidate control and move forward at speeds that were hitherto unknown? And I'm speaking within the context of this year, because we did have breakthroughs of similar sizes last year during August of 2024. That was. But now in July 2025, we're seeing something similar unfold with the breakthroughs across the T0504 highway that pushed about 10 kilometers northwards, and then with the push about 15 kilometers westwards, all the way to the agglomeration defending Murad, and the breakthrough past several layers of defense. So over here, you have this one layer that's protecting Volodymyrivka. So it definitely is in the Russian purview. It's definitely threatened. The only reason why it may not be attacked with any sort of significant intensity is because it is a bit more peripheral to Russia's current objectives. But looking into the future, it is absolutely critical to reach this village and also Shehove in order to cut off the eastern roads that approach Dobropilia. I'm going to start mapping it out in different colors so you guys get a better idea. But you can see even over here on the satellite imagery how it is important, how it does end up connecting ultimately to Dobropilia. And just as a side note, over the past couple of days, the rail line that runs south of Dobropilia has been hit pretty hard. Actual train cars, they are getting targeted in Russian strikes. So Dobropilia on the rear has been hit very hard by FABs. It has for a while, but recently the intensity has increased, and you're just seeing an increase in artillery as well, because Russian forward artillery crews that have a range of between 20 to 30 kilometers, they are now repositioning along the key heights that were taken over by the Russian side, heights that are no longer exposed to Ukraine direct fire, but obviously within 10-kilometer range of the front line. You do have FPV strikes that are very prominent. So that's one factor that's sort of disincentivizing moving D-30s closer, but they still are to a certain degree. But as I was saying, you have this massive network over here of just huge ridges that are located on high elevation. It's like an area that spans 200 square kilometers. And I just want to measure how far away it is from the front line. So for one, it's about 20 kilometers away from Murad if we're sort of being generous to Ukraine. But if you sort of move it a bit closer, the Russians are only about 30 kilometers away from the entrance of Dobropilia, and that's where their forward artillery station. So you have some of the longer range howitzers firing from these areas, and they could actually arrive at the city. And in a couple of weeks, once it becomes more safe, naturally the howitzers are going to be moved a couple more kilometers westwards, and then it's only going to be like 20 kilometers away from the city of Dobropilia. And same sort of story goes for Murnohrad and Pokrovsk. Now that the salient over here, that is just to the east of Novoekonomichny, is on the precipice of falling, a lot of the Russian positions that are nearby are going to become much more safe, and you're going to see the movement of a lot more heavy units, heavy artillery systems towards the front line that will be involved in providing the Russians with the preparation needed to begin targeting, Ukraine's forward positions, whether they be in certain dugouts or certain rings surrounding cities or actual urban defense nodes, actual buildings, actual basements. That's when you're going to see the artillery becoming far more prominent. And Russian artillery is on the uptick over here specifically. You're also seeing Russian airstrikes and specifically fab strikes, for that matter, going up since the winter of 2025. We did have a period of time where the average was around 50 per day, 50 fab strikes, and that was a really low amount compared to much of 2024. There were a couple of factors that I talked about at the time, including Ukraine targeting Russia's supply chain for the chips needed for the UMPKs through China and Taiwan. So that was one factor. The weather was another factor. Ukraine trying to jam them was another attempt at lowering the numbers. But the Russian forces were able to improvise, and mass production is obviously a monthly occurrence. And so there was no shortage of fabs. There was no shortage of UMPK guidance systems as well at this point. So we're seeing now a new renaissance for the amount of fab strikes. There was a sort of peak around April, and then it sort of dipped down to about 150 per day, and it's just steadily on the up and up right now, in between 150 to 200 fabs drop per day, with the not majority, but I'd say plurality of them being dropped in areas northeast of Pokrovsk. So you have the Russian forces. They've been doing this now for about a month or a month and a half. They've just been peppering the entire area that I'm going to circle over here with this red perimeter, just completely decimating all of the tree lines, all of the dugouts that are located over here. So the Russian forces have known for a while that this was going to be their preferred option for attack. So they concentrated the large majority of fab strikes that are dropped on Donetsk specifically, because you have a whole other story with Sumy where you also have a lot of Su-34s dropping fabs. But in particular, looking at Donetsk, the majority of them were dropped in this highlighted area, this perimeter. And that was done before the Russians had infiltrated to here, but it was done in order to systematically destroy every single Ukrainian strong point in a tree line, any feasible area where they can offer up resistance and drag out fighting. And that helped really set the groundwork for Russian ground assaults afterwards. And that was a part of why the Russians were able to overrun a lot of the Ukrainian defenses, which were already pretty thin over here. They were not that dense when it comes to a strong, formidable fortification. Yes, every single tree line in its own rights is a defensive position, but there are varying degrees of effectiveness. And a dugout that was hastily created and is manned by a small amount of forces that is disconnected from the wider, sort of rear, is going to be far weaker and is going to last far less time than a more formidable defense that is sort of circled around a key city. That's at least the perception. But we're actually seeing how part of that is beginning to be disproven with how the Russians have broken through layers of defenses that are actually pretty well built around Razina. And the reason behind that is just acute manpower shortages on the front line in this specific area, despite the fact that the Ukrainians have boosted up and redirected units to help fill gaps over here. And that has definitely been helpful. It's worse than not deploying forces to here, obviously. It's certainly not been enough to man the entire front line. And in this case, man areas that really the Ukrainians should have had foresight for, because they should have anticipated that the Russians would be looking to break through around here, as this was the pattern for where the Russians were concentrating the most airstrikes. So it sort of like logically followed they were going to attack those areas. But the Ukrainians were not sufficiently able to prepare for that from a manpower perspective. And as a result, the Russians were able to steamroll through a lot of these defensive lines that could have been difficult to overrun had they been properly manned. And I believe we can sort of contrast that to how the Russians are having more difficulty overrunning the trenches north of Yablonivka. Obviously, situations are different over here. And actually, the tactical situation for Ukraine in these trenches is even more difficult, but they've been able to drag it out for longer than the Ukrainians around Razina due to the manpower comparison. But really, what's been providing the most assistance for the Ukrainians over here is the fact that Ukraine's drone crews are very active and have been spotting Russian forces getting out of lightly armored vehicles. They can be motorcycles, they can be just private vehicles or Ladas or any sort of van. Those are obviously used much more now by the Russian combined arms armies over here, whether they be the 8th or the 41st or the 51st, which is the DPR Army Corps, as it's now been turned into that. It's been converted to the 51st, but we all know it as the 1st Army Corps. So those are the main Army Corps operating around here, and they have been flooded with an influx of these light armored vehicles, and that's what's used to move troops through this open area that was recently captured past the T0504 highway. And then I can't say exactly where, but it's probably around Kopcheved. They're sort of dismounted, and then they advance on foot towards their desired zone of activity on the front line. And that's done in groups of four or something of that sort, very small squads. And not even a full platoon. You're looking at like a quarter of a platoon being sent to operate in a certain area on its own and trying to exploit the fact that a lot of these areas are completely open. So it's difficult for the Ukrainians to sort of anchor a large group of forces to respond to the Russians. And then the drawdown would be that the Russians in those assault groupings suffer high losses because the drone crews are able to spot them and pick them up within a 10-kilometer radius of the front line. So that's what we end up seeing over here. But it's due to the sheer volume and due to the Ukrainians completely relying in certain cases on drone crews, which are obviously a benefit, but only go so far. They get overwhelmed, and then there's nothing that can be done as the Russians continue steamrolling westwards. Now, we've seen a bit of a stabilization near Chervony Liman and the Krasnolimansky mine over here, but that's only because we don't have any updates and reporting. It's certainly possible that the Russians have been able to infiltrate into these two defense nodes, and we're not aware of it yet because there is secrecy, and there is more so than secrecy, ambiguity due to conflicting reports about the status of these areas, for now marking them as under Ukrainian control. But these are two obvious immediate targets for the Russians as they look to reach Rodinsk. The goal is Rodinsk over here. The Russians are aiming to arrive at it in the very near future and thereby cut off the highway access between Dobropilia, which you see further north over here, and Pokrovsk. That is an important objective for the Russian side right now. And as it's all going on, they're also involved in the capture of 3.5 square kilometers. That includes Novotoretsk, Boykivka, and Fedorivka in order to sort of broaden their horizons, as we said before. And that will allow the Russians to arrive at this highway over here, this paved road, and just further have a secure corridor controlling the rail line and the highway that is north of Munirhad and Pokrovsk. But as I was saying before, the objective is then to turn attention southwards. That's where we're going to see the most opportunism from a Russian perspective. So after Rodinsk, the Russian forces will have an open route by which to reach the road and rather the ring that surrounds and protects Pokrovsk and breach it. That breach will lead to an undermining of Ukraine's defensive apparatus on the outskirts, and it's going to force them to get more concentrated into the actual city. And then you're going to see an attritional battle commence between the Russians and Ukrainians. And then it's a question of how long the Ukrainians can continue with that attritional resistance, given the fact that their flanks are going to be extremely compromised. Because on its own, in isolation, if there was an attritional battle in Pokrovsk, despite what I was saying about manpower deficiencies, if all those units that you see circled around here, around this sort of crescent, were to be concentrated in the smaller surface areas of these two cities, then they would obviously have the ability to resist for an extended period of time within 60 square kilometers. So it's not that significant of a surface area. That's an isolation, though. We're looking at an area that is already in a salient, an area that's already outstretched, and logistics are very difficult, even as things stand, both along the E50 highway, along the highway to Dobropilia, or along the local road that crosses through Hirishny. So it's only going to be exacerbated as time goes on as the Russians cut off this highway over here and then probably make an effort to push through these open fields because there's going to be a lack of resistance, a lack of on the ground resistance. Drone crews are going to be very active, but they can only do so much. And then you're going to see an attempt. I'm not saying that it will happen in this particular order, because there's always going to be changes based on where the Russians sense the best opportunity and the sort of the most weaknesses in the Ukrainian line. But the Russian forces strengthening their forces, first of all, and also uptaking attacks through Udachny and Kotline is now becoming a real possibility, because the reason why the attack stopped is because the Ukrainians moved in reinforcements and were able to hold on to the populated areas. But as the Ukrainians are forced to redirect their attention northeastwards, towards Fedorivka, towards Rudinske, as the battles get closer and closer to these populated areas, that's when you actually need infantry to be deployed to engage in house-to-house fighting. When the fighting is relegated to open fields, you can sort of get away with not deploying as many on-the-ground forces, because drone crews are going to do much of the attritional work. So that's going to lead to probably some deficiencies on the western flank, and I believe that will lead to Russian exploitations on the western flank. I still believe that the main vector of attack will be from the northeast, and also direct entrances through Novoekonomichny. But I do think that there will eventually be gaps forming along the T046 highway and along the rail line that will lead to the Russians getting closer to the E50 highway. And all in all, that logistic situation is going to become an Achilles heel for the Ukrainian defense of Pokrovsk. It is not yet, because you see over here that the lid around the agglomeration is still 17.5 kilometers, which is sufficient for now. But I am saying, though, that the routes out of here, the escape routes, they are under daily bombardment. They are getting harassed by FPV drones on a daily basis. So the Ukrainians actually set up nets. They set up these massive nets that encompass the entirety of the flanks and the upper parts of the highway. So they're supposed to be covering the entirety of the highway. They're literally set up like a tent that is obviously see through because it's a net, but it's supposed to stave off attacks from drones. So the Russian forces have obviously then used the drones to just break through and attack the nets. So instead of attacking vehicles, now the drones are just trying to create holes and gaps in the nets that is defending the highway. And they were able to do that with success, which means that the vehicles that are moving back and forth along this particular road are going to be more exposed and going to be more vulnerable to attacks. So that's something the Ukrainians have to work on. They need to work on beefing up the defenses along the highway to set up all of these anti-drone nets. The same thing was done by the Russians, by the way, around Bakhmut. They set up in the city of Bakhmut and just to its west a lot of anti-drone nets, and that's going to become commonplace across all of Donetsk as we move forward. This is the future of the conflict. In that regard. So Ukrainians should already be preparing to do the same thing with Dobropilya and all of the highways that are extending out of it to Kramatorsk, for instance. So that's just a heads up. Zooming in, though, on some of the updates, the Russian forces have very likely taken over this section, this salient that is sort of outstretched from Novoekonomichny. I'm just waiting for final confirmation through geolocations or an official announcement from a Ukrainian source like Petrenko, but I've not seen it yet. I think we're going to get it very soon, though, because at this point, it's just extremely difficult to imagine and comprehend that the Ukrainians would have forward operators located, say, 5 kilometers to the southeast of Novoekonomichny, which itself is already on the precipice of being targeted by the Russians from 3 directions. And the objective afterwards would be to turn this into a forward base. It's a large populated area with a lot of basements. It's not fully destroyed, so it can be used as an organization point. It's very close to Munirhad. And by the way, Munirhad is not on high elevation in many sections of it. The northeastern part of the city is actually on a lower lying valley that is partially overlooked by the Russians right now. The Russians are going to continue taking over territory that overlooks this section of Munirhad as they push westwards towards the highway. And they're also going to take over local terracons, and that will give them amazing vantage points. Those positions will be used to, at the very least, create parity with the Ukrainian side elevation wise, because obviously on Pokrovsk, the elevation is just uncontested. Only the fields to the north can really rival it. And Munirhad, the southern section, is a bit higher in terms of topography, but the north is on a lower lying location. So it's naturally going to be exposed to future Russian attacks and suppressive fire. So again, look at that in the future. But again, as I've been reiterating, this northeastern flank is going to become a difficulty, and it's going to be an area that the Ukrainians need to send more reinforcements towards, even as things stand. And I want to get into the order of battle before moving on to other parts of the front line. But what I want to say is that the Ukrainians over here, they recently moved in a lot of assault units that are involved in, first of all, a lot of engagements on the front line, directly confronting Russian soldiers, firing towards their tanks whenever they are exhibited trying to retake a basement or retaking a local dugout, clearing out a house. They are really experts in many of those activities, these units. And so I may have mentioned this in an earlier video, but the Scala Assault Regiment, the 210th Assault Regiment Berlingo, previously stationed in Chasiv Yar, then redeployed to Sumy, and now redeployed to Pokrovsk. It's now operating around here. And the 1st Assault Regiment, I believe, Da Vinci's Wolves, another one of those similar types of units. And even though a lot of the sort of general battalion, infantry battalions, TDF battalions are suffering from acute shortages, the assault regiments, their entire existence is predicated on sort of understanding and accepting the fact that they don't have that much manpower, but then sort of building up a strong but small fighting force that can effectively overrun positions. And we're not talking about major offensives. We're talking about on a tactical, or not even tactical, but just like on a positional level, taking back a specific area that's needed in order to just drag out fighting or secure favorable areas. So that's why they've been moved in, and they're going to try to do that to the best of their ability, especially along the salient, because it is certainly becoming very concerning for the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration. But to get into the order of battle, we looked at it, or I looked at it rather, and based on the deployment of brigades over here that have been sent in recent months, also battalions that are operating around here, independent regiments, drone crews, you add up the numbers, and a sort of lesser minimum estimate would be 30,000. I put it at 33,000 as the sort of a lower end estimate, but you could have it as low as 30,000. The upper end estimates, and I'm talking about the area that spans from the western flank of Pokrovsk, meaning Udachny over here, all the way to Popvivyar, this area over here. So it is an expansive part of the front line. It is not just a city of Pokrovsk itself. So don't be misunderstanding of the context of which areas I'm referring to. I'm referring to a 70-kilometer span of the front line. And within that 70 kilometers, you can add up the sizes on paper of the brigades. And that's why this is not a perfect science. But all in all, it should be a minimum of 33,000 and a maximum of 51,000. I lean towards the lower end estimates. I always have when it comes to the sizes of garrisons, because we're looking at areas that are pretty close to the front line, and there's also a lot of fluidity where troops move in and out and get redeployed many times to other locations. So you can never be sure about the exact number. I would say based on that it's probably around 37, 38,000, maybe 40,000 at most that are located around this area. But as I reiterated, the higher end estimate, if you choose to believe it, is 51,000. Meanwhile, the Russian side, the higher end estimate that I heard from the Ukrainians themselves at the beginning of or the late period of June, Siersky, he claimed that the Russians had 110,000 soldiers running along the 70-kilometer span of the front line. So at first glance, to me, that seemed to be sort of unrealistic, but you sort of consider the fact that you have at least portions of three combined arms armies that are operating around here, which on paper, I don't know if it's actually like this in reality now, because there are a lot of shifts, and there are also going to be obviously to certain degrees losses and turnover rates that are very high. So it should be around 50,000 per combined arms army. So then it can get close to 150K at full strength, but probably it's going to be far lower than that. So then the 110 number doesn't sound that unrealistic. But when adding up the individual units that are involved in assault operations over here, which are mainly from that 41st Combined Arms Army, and there are a lot of like honorable mentions for the units involved, like the 55th Brigade, 35th Brigade, 74th Brigade, 137th Assault Brigade. Like all these units have been extremely critical parts of even arriving at the outskirts of Pokrovsk and also expanding along this northeastern salient. So you look at the sum total of these units and then sort of extrapolate based on that the amount of forces on paper that a Russian regiment, battalion, or brigade would have. And you have a range that is at minimum 34,000, which I don't believe to be true. That's on the a far lower end. and you would expect that there would be a disproportionately high amount of Russian soldiers over here because it is a focal point for advances, and it's very close to Donetsk and Avdiivka, which act as forward logistics hubs, training hubs, and dispersion areas. So I do believe that the higher end estimate is also rather unlikely, which is 110,000 based on the addition that I did. So if it's going to be somewhere in between, then perhaps 70,000, 60,000, that's something that could be more feasible. So having maybe 65,000 Russian forces deployed over here, perhaps 70,000, as opposed to the Ukrainians with between 35 to 40,000. That's the general idea for the sizes. It's a bit less than 2 to 1 for the ratio in favor of the Russian side. But despite that fact, we do know that the brunt of the current casualties that are inflicted on the Russians are done through those drone crews like the Birds of Magyar. Although once it enters into an urban setting, that will begin to change. So that's just sort of my understanding of the tactical situation and the deployment of forces. So hopefully you guys like that. And let's look at other parts of the front line. So starting off with Yablonivka, the Russian forces have been able to make inroads and capture 33 hectares of territory. They pushed along the main road and were able to push 1.3 kilometers eastwards. In the process, they are now isolating certain sections of the town. So you can see over here how the extension into Alexander Kalinova is under immense danger from the west and from the south. So this pincer maneuver can help squeeze out the Ukrainian forces that are trying to hold out over here. And in the process, the objective of the Russians is to fully dislodge the Ukrainians from their formidable trench lines, which have several layers, as we talked about. Will well built with a lot of consideration for the nearby topography and obstacles. So well-built trenches, anti-tank ditches, mines, barbed wire, all of that is involved. And then you have to send in ground forces to clear out each site individually. So that's what's happening around here. And it's a part of the benefit that the Russians would receive from fully clearing out this area. So then from there, you would have a huge emphasis on Kostantinivka in the near future. But first, Yablonivka has to be taken over, and it's a part of why the Ukrainians are sending in reinforcements that sort of block that movement. You can also see north of Romanivka the capture of 3.2 square kilometers of territory on the highway that runs to Kostantinivka to the north. So these are large filler areas in open fields that are no longer conducive for Ukrainian defense purposes. There are not many defenses to anchor towards to besides the aforementioned hedgerows. So these are areas that the Russians can actually seize depending on their willingness to sort of risk ground forces to drone crews. But besides that, they can definitely push through here. What I've been noticing, though, is that a lot of the Russian assaults have focused on the southern outskirts of Kateryivka. So the Russian activity that is north of Leonidivka and basically near Novospassky has exponentially increased in recent days. The Russian forces are making a lot of gains over here that I've not mapped yet because they're not confirmed, but just sort of the discussions from the Ukrainian side on the ground is that the Russian forces have been able to make inroads northwest of Novospassky, which raises questions about whether the Ukrainians are even in Shcherbenivka at this point to any meaningful degree. But the Russians are trying to occupy the southern outskirts of Kateryivka, including some of the trenches over here. The effort is being spearheaded by the 68th Tank Regiment, and the Tank Regiment is not actually using tanks during its day-to-day operations. It's using, for the most part, its supply of motorcycles, armored vehicles, and the like. You could see over here that the Russian forces captured what amounts to 1.3 square kilometers of territory just west of the Zabalka district as they continue approaching Shcherbenivka. This means that the noose around this settlement is continuing to tighten, and it will give the Russians a lot more operational flexibility to move forces and connect between the New York, Nelipivka, and Touretsk agglomerations once this area does fall. And that's when I believe we're actually going to see in earnest an assault towards Kateryivka, and that will have a lot of implications for this span of open fields that are basically south of the Beek Reservoir, as it's called, and the current front line. So this entire area, which is rather large, it's not that well defended, but it is large, will be in grave threats. And that's when you're going to see the solid base for an attack on Konstantinivka begin to form. It's going to be through those maneuvers. And that's another one of Russia's main objectives for the latter portion of this year. As we talked about, closing the Pokrovsk salient entirely is one objective. And the other one is to unify the fronts between Yablonivka, Turetsk, and Chasiv Yar by closing in on Konstantinivka. That's the other objective. And we will continue reiterating that throughout the latter portion of this year, throughout summer and fall, and obviously the beginning of winter. So over here in Seversk, you have the Russian forces capturing 3.3 square kilometers of territory. There's a video from July 18th of the 2nd Battalion of the 123rd Motor Rifle Brigade assaulting Ukrainian trenches, overrunning them, delivering direct fire. So this amounts to an advance of, let's see, this is 1.5 kilometers westwards. And you can see how the line is sort of straightened out. There has been a correction of the front line. A lot of the forward Ukrainian positions, which were held by very small squads that were, in many cases, poorly, backed by the Ukrainian rear, by the supply lines. Regardless, they were able to hold out because the Russian intensity was pretty low. Now that the Russians are putting their foot down in many of these salients, not least of which includes this salient that is to the west of Bilohorivka, you're beginning to see a correction of the front line. And it's a correction that just by nature forces the Russians or forces the Ukrainians on the back foot and only gives them a buffer zone of around 4 kilometers before arriving at Siversk itself. But given the fact that this is a tertiary part of the front line, it's not an immediate objective for the Russians to close in on Siversk, even with the tactical situation and local positions falling into Russian hands. It is not something that is an existential crisis for the town. So let's look at a couple of advances from southern Donetsk before moving on to Sumy. You can see over here, the Russians have made inroads towards Zeleny High. They were able to capture 0.6 square kilometers of territory. They're now in the process of actually clearing out the village. We'll see if that's successful. I'll talk about the Ukrainian response. They are trying to build up a proper buffer zone south of Novopavlivka, something which I warned about. I said that if the Ukrainians were unable to counterattack in Dakhny, then they would have no means by which to actually resist the attacks towards Novopavlivka. But due to the efforts of the 37th Marine Brigade, the village of Dakhny has been partially retaken, meaning that there is a lot of breathing room because, first of all, you have to overrun the obstacle itself over here of Dakhny. It just creates more physical separation between Novopavlivka and the Russians, but also it just does sort of individualize or sort of concentrate the fighting on one particular area that's associated with houses and basements and such, instead of allowing the Russians to pour all of their efforts into deploying motorcyclists and armored vehicles to advance 8 kilometers northwards and enter into the village itself. So this is very important, and that's why the Ukrainians are willing to expend resources on these sorts of counterattacks that actually do have a positional utility. You can see over here in Yalta, the Russians captured 0.73 square kilometers, or rather, the Ukrainians did. You can see over here, July 17th, the 505th Marine Battalion of the 37th Brigade, they captured Yalta. They raised their flag, I believe, and that is a good indication of the fourth position. So, really, I believe their ability to counterattack is limited because of the river and due to the distances from nearby organization points. And I do think that once the Russians are completed with their operations on the eastern bank of the Vopch River, they will have a bit more leeway to sort of turn their attention and retake some of the areas being lost right now. But for the time being, this means that Novopavlivka is not under immediate danger. Much more concerning would be the status of Ivanivka and Havrilivka because of how close they are to the Russian side right now. And really, their saving grace would be the fact that there is a river separating the Russian attacks and where they are right now. Over here, south of Mirny, the Russians captured 11.5 square kilometers of territory. Looking at the vertical or rather horizontal advance, it's about 7.8 kilometers westwards, meaning that the Russians have now been able to take advantage of the roads that are branching out of Mirny and use them as a route to assault the northern outskirts of Voskresenka. But so far, they've not actually been able to situate themselves within the northern outskirts yet. So we'll keep an eye out for that development. And then from there, we'll see how that sort of abides or bodes, I should say, for the Ukrainians defending the border with Dnipro. Looking at Shevchenko, the Russians have been able to expand zero point 0.8 kilometers westwards, taking over some of the farmhouses and the open fields as they get increasingly closer to Malivka on the border with Dnipro and try to overrun more generally the line of defense that extends from the Mokryali River Valley all the way, by the way, to the Dnipro River bank over here to the west. So it is an extensive line, and the Russians are chipping away at it over here. Zooming in, you can see the Russians captured what amounts to 1.73 square kilometers of territory just north of Zelenopole. So this is a part of, once again, consolidating control over the vast swaths of open fields, which are difficult to advance through in the sense that drone crews are very active over here, and that makes it very dangerous. But within the context of engaging with Ukrainian soldiers and pushing them out, that's not the main concern because in many cases they aren't even deployed over here anymore. In many cases, these forces are on the other side of the state boundary. But with the sort of advances that are sort of all coalescing now along the border, you will see far more chunks of territory in terms of surface area falling because there are so many open fields over here. And we will surely cover that, but not just that, but also the considerations for how this can have an effect on the defensive aspects of Dnipro. But I do still think that is more of a secondary concern. I didn't say tertiary because I do still think this is the level above many of the other parts of the front line we've been talking about. But for sure, the areas of the northeast are more important to the Russian camp. A few more things before I end the video. First of all, I want to look at this video from Ukrainian DRGs. They were able to raise their flag in Western Pokrovsk. As you guys recall, this is a part of Mykolaiv Oblast. It's on the Kinburn Spit, actually. And if we're looking at Ochakiv, which acts as a massive naval base, naval operating base for the Ukrainians, not because it has a lot of naval assets, not because it has boats or anything of the sort, but because it's an area for production of these unmanned underwater surface vessels. So you could see over here that the flag planting is about 7.5 kilometers away from Ochakiv, and this was done by a drone most likely, although the Ukrainians were trying to claim that it was a DRG. So I'm not sure, and I won't change it depending. I will only be dependent on whether there's further corroboration of that claim. But I thought it would just be an interesting tidbit to mention it for you guys. But I do want to finish off by looking at Sumy Oblast because we do have a video from this location. First of all, just a few things from Kharkiv. So let's zoom in over here. You can see that there's this video of the Russian forces being targeted by the Rubaka FPV group. It's a part of the 77th Air Assault Brigade, which has been a critical part of the defensive equation over here for the Ukrainian side. So they dropped grenades and conducted FPV strikes onto these Russian infantry as they were north of Borivska, Andrivka, and trying to seep into some of the nearby trenches and hedgerows that are very close to a local pond and just sort of directly feed into Borivska. So this area is certainly under a lot of pressure, and this serves as a first breaching point for the line that is supposed to defend the outer limits of Borova. There are two lines. The first one is currently being overrun. Now, looking at Sumi, I want to conclude the video with Sumi. You can see that there is I believe, a report from the Ukrainian side because this was just released by Deep States. They say that the Russians have captured 4.9 square kilometers of territory, which includes the remnants of Yablonivka that were in a gray zone and also areas that are directly west of Yunikivka. So let's see the extent of the advance. You can see that it amounts to 3 kilometers southwards. So this is important because it gives the Russian forces a strong, solid flank from the west to act as a battering ram onto the Ukrainian resistance that is not just in Yunikivka, but also along the routes feeding into it, like this one. So this one can, come under increased scrutiny now. So this will obviously play a role in Unikiva's battle, but also because it gives direct access to the highway that leads to the chain of villages that is currently being defended by the Ukrainians. Due to the counterattacks in Kindra, Tivka, and Andrivka, the Ukrainians have been able to release a lot of pressure valves that were, beginning to ramp up in Sumy Oblast. So the Ukrainians now have this opportunity, a short window of time to sort of beef up their defenses and replenish forces that are running along this line from Krovny all the way to Krapishino. So this area is very close to where the Russians are currently operating, only about 5.5 kilometers away. But nonetheless, they are trying to protect their holdings. And with these assaults on these two villages, they have been successful in doing that. But having the pressure coming in from the main garrison, the main pool of Russian forces, because the advances that came over here from the west were from a smaller contingent of Russian forces, which was trying to connect with the larger one. So now, if the larger one is going to directly get involved in these assaults, that can play a role in overrunning these key targets. Because, as I said before, Sumi may not be the most important part of the front line right now, but it's probably in the top three. And so there is still going to be a concerted effort to overrun this line, which will then give the Russians a really free reign in a lot of ways to get closer to the city itself, the city of Sumi. There have been a lot of rotations, though. There's been a lot of fatigue from the Russian side, from the 83rd Air Assault Brigade, from the 155th and 180th, or sorry, not 180th, but 810th Naval Infantry Brigades. I'll click on them over here for you guys. This is the, not that, but here you have the 155th Marine Brigade. Here's the 810th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade, and I really hope I find the 83rd because I'm sure it was around here. But regardless, my point is these were just inseparable parts of the defensive campaign and then assaults into Sumi by the Russian side. So their rotation out is to be expected after intense fighting, but it doesn't mean that there's a vacuum of ability left in their wake, which would be from various other air assault units that are deployed over here. They still are. You do have them over here on the map. You can click on them. So these units have taken up that role and are engaged in the fighting now. You also have certain naval infantry units like the 177th, I believe it's called, and the 40th that are deployed over here, and they are engaged in the daily minutia. Uh, and something I was mentioning earlier is that a large percentage, maybe more than a third even, of the FAB strikes launched by the Russians in recent months have been directed towards Sumy Oblast. This was going on as the Russians were really finalizing with their closure of Kursk and their shift into Sumy. So they were already preparing for large scale offensive activities. That was always a part of their goals, as we've been talking about for a while. And the brunt of the strikes were all concentrated on these areas over here that have been epicenters of fighting. So they naturally go together. This outline does show you guys where most of those FAB strikes were concentrated and includes areas that have already been taken over by the Russians in recent weeks. And it also includes the next line of villages, line number 2, as I call it, which is a natural target for the Russian side going forward. So that's all I have for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.